Hey, it's Mr. Grandy. How you doing? This is my first video. Welcome to Big History Virtual 346. Here we are. Even got some of the same old trappings of real 346. You can see right behind me. Remember, there's some of our old buddies, some of the classroom plants. And to start things off, let's go with the singing bowl. Here we go. All right. Well, it's great to see you, or for you to see me. Anyway, I'm going to be joined by another friend. Uh, let me introduce you to him right now. This guy right here, who I don't think looks like me. But anyway, he and about 30 of his friends are sitting right over there. Uh, they and a bunch of Legos and Playmobil and things have created an obstacle course here in my studio. My daughter refers to this as my living room, whatever. Anyway, well, I don't want to waste your time. I'll send you some more in email, but let's get started. This is video number 1 of 2 on the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was something that I did not study at all when I was in high school. Not because it hadn't happened yet. I know what you're thinking. No, it had happened. Because I had a straight up European-centric, Eurocentric curriculum. Turns out the Haitian Revolution is one of the most important events of modern world history. And I'm going to talk about that. But first, let's go back just a little bit to where we were right before we went into virtual mode. So I had introduced Latin America as a unit, and we had talked just briefly about some of the big themes of Latin America, namely the conquest of Europeans, the forcible import of Africans to create this cultural, ethnic, national blend by force. And as a result, Latin America became a cauldron of race and class in a very tight stratification, tight hierarchy that to this day casts a shadow over much of the events of Latin America. So we looked at matters of race and class and labor and how all those forces combined make up a person's status historically in Latin America and really much, for the most part, elsewhere in the world. We looked at those casta paintings, which were really pieces of propaganda to reinforce that idea of hierarchy, of stratification, that you need to know your place, you don't leave that place. But it was a complicated mix, and there could be some change and some variation in that over time. I talked a little bit about how eventually throughout Latin America there were independence movements. They'll begin with Haiti. Of course, the first independence movement in the Americas was here in the United States, which followed a little bit of a different path. But the second republic to be created, the second representative government in the Americas, was Haiti, formerly known as Saint-Domingue. And then much of Latin America will follow over the next several decades. That's the first wave of revolutions, which were really independence movements. The second wave will happen in the 1900s, and we'll look at our next case, which will be the Mexican Revolution, roughly 1910 to 1920. So that'll be a different sort of revolution. The first wave of revolutions or independence movements promised liberty. They promised equality. They took the ideals both from the American and French revolutions and applied them in their struggle for independence, either from a European power, in the case of the United States, or from the monarchy, as the case in France was, to establish a new system. France was more of a revolution. The United States was really more of a war for independence. The Haitian Revolution will really be both of those things. It's a war of independence from France. Excuse me. It's also a revolution, and that's trying to refigure that whole social hierarchy. And as we'll see at the end of video number 2, that is incomplete, just as the French Revolution. In fact, just as any revolution is incomplete. Chinese Revolution of 1949, the Russian Revolution of 1917, none achieved their ultimate stated goals, and each are saddled with problems afterwards. All right, I'm going to switch this over to slides, and we're going to go through our first part here of the Haitian Revolution. Let's see if I can find that, if I situated it properly. Give me just a second. And yeah, that's actually what we're looking at not right there. Here we go. All right, this is all part of the learning curve. So let's go through this. And I'm going to go through kind of quickly. This should be a little bit of review. You can also go back to it, and you can also go to the links of just the slides. So a little bit of background. We talked about this in class, but let's move through this now. The island of Hispaniola, which were populated largely by Taino Indians, 90% of them were killed in the conquest of the Spaniards. Later, the French will arrive, but the Spaniards are going to name this island Hispaniola. The French arrive and take over the western third, the third of the island facing west, and they name it Saint-Domingue after a Catholic saint. All right, you can see a little bit of a close-up there of Haiti or Saint-Domingue. To the right or to the east is Dominican Republic, also still a country that will retain much of its Spanish legacy. In fact, Spanish is spoken there, as you probably know. Let's move on a little bit. Again, I'm just kind of racing through this. We talked about this. Haiti was one of many colonies of France, many European colonies. It was certainly the wealthiest French colony, and at some point was probably the wealthiest American colony in European hands. The main source, of course, the primary source was sugar. That is the most important commodity in the transatlantic slave trade. It's going to supply at one point 40% of all of Europe's supply of sugar. Sugar has to be grown more or less in a tropical environment, a little bit in the very southern coast of the United States, but it's much more of a Caribbean, Brazilian commodity. Coffee will be also significant. And just the slave trade itself will be an important part of the Haitian economy or the colonial economy of Saint-Domingue. All right, let's move forward again. Just to review, we talked a little bit about how Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, was on the cusp of the movement, the phase of modern history that begins in the late 18th century. The French Revolution established some of those themes, that is the importance of individual liberty, representative government, equality. And at the same time, capitalism was developing. Capitalism promised a form of freedom as well, a form of economic freedom, that any individual should be able to participate equally in the economy and to, as a result of their labor, accumulate profit. But as we saw in class, these two things are actually in conflict with each other. Slaves really did not have access to capitalism. They were subject to it. They were exploited by it to build wealth for the dominant capitalist and growing economies of Europe. So those two modern themes are happening at once: capitalism, the movement for rights, but they were exclusive. They did not include everyone. And we see, if I want to bring this really present tense, even in this pandemic, COVID-19 that we're seeing right now, we're seeing the fractures and fault lines and fissures of inequality that are a legacy of hundreds of years of history across the world. And we're seeing that there is and there will be great pain among those who do not have full equality of privilege in the societies in which they live. So these are important themes for sure. Just moving ahead a little bit quickly here, I'm going to skip this slide because I sort of just talked about that. Just to remind you, of course, slavery was a very cruel system that involved typically Europeans arriving on the western coast, trading with certain kingdoms for guns, rum, all sorts of other commodities, tools for slaves, which were brought initially from the coast and later from further in the interior, brought on these awful voyages that might have lasted a couple months, where human cargo was packed tightly and cruelly, and a significant number, perhaps 15% of those on those ships died in the voyage. As you can see from this map here, right, the majority of slaves will originate in this sort of central coast, at times called the Gold Coast and Slave Coast, and would arrive in the Americas. The largest number would arrive in the Caribbean. The country with the largest um, number of slaves to arrive, of course, is Brazil, in its former capital, Salvador, which was the easternmost point facing Africa. Hence, it was the capital and also major point of slave receiving. Just a little close-up of some of the key areas where slaves departed from. Slaves, of course, would arrive in places like Haiti with different languages, traditions, religious traditions, ethnicities, nationalities, and then were sort of just thrown together to create new cultures and to survive. And again, you see the major slave ports. Only about 5% of those arrived in the United States. So whereas we often think of slavery being part of the American story, it is. We forget oftentimes that it is also part of the America's story. And again, just this quick graph here, you can see sugar being the major occupation as well, major first employment of slaves who arrive in the Americas. More than half of all slaves who arrive at some point worked in sugar. So that is what will bring us here to the last bit, which is the social structure of Haitian society. It is a slave economy. That is to say that the dominant force in politics and economics is slavery, and that will conform to those social groupings, that social hierarchy that I talked about at the beginning, that we talked about in class. So let's look at the major, 6 major groups. Those who are considered Black or of direct African descent. In Haiti, that's 90% of the population. This includes both laborers, slave drivers who had some status above, I could say, a common slave. And then women in particular had sort of a double oppression, both being subject to the oppression that were put upon women, but also due to their race or heritage of being African. Above them were the mixed race, or sometimes called mulatto. That was a term that was used commonly at the time, sort of overlapping with the term of gens de couleur, or men of color. So this is a really interesting case here, because on the one hand, they were mixed race. On the one hand, many of them had tremendous amount of economic privilege. They were landowners. They sent their children to France to become educated. Some of them even owned or rented slaves. And we'll see Toussaint Louverture, one of the great heroes of the Haitian Revolution, at one time managed slaves himself. They, at the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, which is also the beginning of the French Revolution, they begin to petition for their rights, not for the end of slavery. They see themselves as above the slaves for the most part. They see themselves as distinct. They want to achieve privilege. They want to see themselves really as French. And Toussaint Louverture, pretty much at the end of his life, identifies or aspires to being the leader of a French colony, but that one that is run by the former slaves themselves, not to be an independent country. Okay, then we have 2 major groups of whites or Creoles. These are people of European descent, but born in the Americas. The Grand Blanc are the wealthy landowning class. They own the plantations, they own a large number of slaves, and they are sympathetic to the French Revolution because they don't want the monarchy breathing down their back. They want to develop profit unhindered by any sort of desires by the aristocracy of the king. Below them are the Petit Blanc, the little whites. These include people doing a lot of physical labor. So they're like the artisans of the third estate in France. They work with their hands, they do physical work, they're artisans, they're crafts workers. They don't make a lot of money. They make a lot less money. They have a lot less money than the gens de couleur, in fact. They also identify with the Third Estate as the French Revolution begins to heat up. And this is one of the interesting keys to the complexity of the story. They also harbor tremendous resentment towards the gens de couleur. The Grand Blanc just sort of see them as slaves and have general disregard, but the Petit Blanc really see them as competition. How dare those gens de couleur have any sort of uppity attitudes? How dare they be wealthier than me and have more privilege and more refinement than me? as a white person, is kind of what they're thinking. So they sort of have a much more physical expression of racism and oppression towards both Black and mixed race people. And then finally, the really most elite group of all are, for the most part, back in France, although they may travel back and forth. Many of them own plantations, but don't live in Haiti. They live in France. This is the maritime bourgeoisie. They are profiting very directly and handsomely from the slave trade. All those goods, and from slavery itself, all those goods that are worked by slaves, such as sugar, coffee, etc. They're all coming into French ports where they then manufacture them and sell them. So they are really at the top of the system. They're the bankers, they're the financiers. They are funding the slave system and then profiting immensely from it. So that's the end of video number 1. I will see you soon if I can.